Hey, good morning. I am Dr.K.Amutha, Assistant Professor of Zoology, A.D.M.College for Women, Nagapattinam. Today I am going to talk about the topic ecological succession. First, we must know what is ecological succession. Ecological succession is the process that describes how the structure of a biological community, that is an interacting group of various species in a desert, forest, grassland, marine environment and so on, changes over the time. This is known as ecological succession. The structure of this community becomes more complex as new species arrive on the scene. This is the ecological succession. And what are the ecological succession stages? Ecological succession breaks down into three fundamental phases: primary, secondary and climax state. These are the three succession stages in the ecological succession. The study of ecological succession generally focuses on the plants present on a particular site, but animal populations also shift over time in response to the changing habitat of the environment. Ecological succession, it is the process by which the structure of a biological community evolves over time. Two different types of succession, that is primary and secondary. They have been distinguished. Primary succession occurs in essentially lifeless areas, regions in which the soil is incapable of sustaining life as a result of such factors as lava flows, newly formed sand dunes or rocks, or left from retreating glaciers. Then secondary section occurs in areas where a community that previously existed has been removed. It is typified by smaller scale disturbance that do not eliminate all life and nutrients from the environment. These the secondary section occurring areas. Next one is why does ecological section occurs? What is the reason for this? Every species has a set of environmental conditions under which it will grow and reproduce most optimally. So, ecological succession may also occur when the conditions of an environment suddenly and drastically change. That reason only ecological succession occurs. Then types of ecological succession. What are the types of ecological succession? Already know we have two primary section and secondary section. There are two following types of ecological section. First one is the primary section. The primary section is the section that starts in lifeless areas such as the regions devoid of soil or the areas where the soil is unable to sustain life. When the planet was formed, there was no soil on the earth. The earth was only made up of rocks. These rocks were broken down by microorganisms and eroded to form soil. After that only the soil then becomes the foundation of plant life. These plants help in the survival of different animals and progress from primary section to the climax, primary, secondary, then to the climax community. If this primary ecosystem is destroyed, secondary section takes place. The primary and secondary section both create a continually changing mix of species within the communities. As disturbances of different intensities, sizes and frequencies alter the landscape, the sequential progression of species during succession. However, it is not random. At every stage, certain species have evolved life histories to exploit the particular conditions of the community. This situation imposes a partially predictable sequence of change in the species composition of communities during succession. So, the primary and secondary mixing the communities. Initially, only a small number of species from surrounding habitats are capable of thriving in a disturbed habitat. As new plant species take hold, they modify the habitat by altering such things as the amount of shade on the ground or the mineral composition of the soil. These changes allow other species that are better suited to this modified habitat to succeed the old species. These newer species are superseded in turn by still newer species. A similar succession of animal species occurs and the interactions between plants and animals and the environment influence the pattern and rate of successional change. So the figure shows the primary section. First one is the pioneer species, then intermediate species, then the climax community. This is the primary, secondary and tertiary. The first the soil formed from the rock, bare rock, then lichens formed, then small annual plants and lichens formed, then grasses and perennial plants formed, then grasses, shrubs, shade intolerant trees such as pines formed. Then finally the climax stage, everything is formed. Shade tolerant trees such as oak and hickory are also formed. Then secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs when the primary ecosystem gets destroyed. After the primary ecosystem gets destroyed, the secondary succession formed. For example, a climax community gets destroyed by fire, it gets recolonized after the destruction. This is known as secondary ecological succession. Small plants emerge first, followed by larger plants. The tall trees block the sunlight and change the structure of the organisms below the canopy. Finally, the climax community arrives. This is the secondary section. For example, for the secondary section is after a forest fire that kills all the mature trees on a particular landscape. Grasses might grow, followed by shrubs and a variety of tree species, until eventually the community that existed before the fire is present again. Secondary section begins after a disturbance like a fire. This is the example for the secondary succession. Secondary section follows a major disturbance such as a fire or a flood. The stages of secondary section are similar to those of a primary section. However, primary section always begins on a barren surface, whereas secondary section begins in environments that already possess soil. In addition, through a process called old field succession, that is the farmland that has been abandoned may undergo the secondary section. So, the secondary section formed from the primary section. In some environments, succession reaches a climax, which produces a stable community that is dominated by a small number of prominent species. This state of equilibrium is called the climax community. So, it's thought to result when the web of the biotic interactions becomes so intricate that no other species can be admitted. In other environments, continual small-scale disturbances produce communities that are a diverse mix of species, and any species may become the dominant. Here, pioneer species, intermediate species and climax community. This 150 years, it attains around 150 years mature trees comes. Then pioneer communities. The first seral stage in any instance of biological succession is called a pioneer community. In general, a pioneer communities are harsh environments that support relatively little flora and fauna. A field, for instance, has only the ground level and underground level at which to support animal and plant life. There is little shelter from the sun, wind and rain. These are the pioneer communities. Then climax communities, it is the last stage, the last serial stage in a process of biological succession. It is called the climax community. In these climax communities are much more stable environments than the pioneer communities, and they support a much wider array of plant and animal life. Here, a fully grown forest, for instance, has many more habitats for animals than a field does. So, many types of birds can nest in these trees, as can animals such as squirrels and chipmunks. So, forests provide more shelter from the elements and they provide habitat for larger animal species as well as. Next, controlled succession. In some instances, human beings try to manage biological succession to keep a particular area at a certain serial stage. This is often done for educational purposes, as in the case of a wildlife park open to the public. So, the succession is sometimes controlled for safety reasons as well, usually to render an area of forest less susceptible to wildlife. and wildfire. Although some human activities such as agriculture, logging and mining interfere with the natural process of biological succession, these are not considered instances of controlled succession because that is not the primary aim. It is a secondary one. Why does secondary succession occurs faster than the primary succession? This figure shows this primary succession and secondary succession. Here the figure shows what is secondary succession, how does it occur, what is a pioneer species. First secondary succession starts from the rocks, and then forest fire occurs, then pioneer species arrived, then shrubs and herbs came, and then finally the tree community came. The stages of primary succession are explained here. First one is the pioneer stage, second one is the intermediate stage, and third one is the climax community. It will take hundreds of years to take a primary succession. The process of succession. Primary and secondary succession both create a continually changing mix of species within communities as disturbances of different intensities, sizes and frequencies alter the landscape. The sequential progression of species during succession, however, it is not random. At every stage, certain species have evolved life histories to exploit the particular conditions of the community. This situation imposes a partially predictable sequences change in the species composition of communities during the succession process. Community structure can be stratified both vertically and horizontally during the process of succession. As species become adapted to their habitat, gradations in environmental factors such as light, temperature or water are responsible for this fractionation. The vertical stratification that occurs within forest results from the varying degrees of light that the different strata receive. The taller the plant and the more foliage it produces, the more light it can intercept. 3 or more vertical strata of plants on herb layer, a shrub layer, a small tree layer and a canopy tree layer often are found in a forest. This is the community structure. Here the animals are affected by this stratification of plant life, both vertical and horizontal stratification. Although they can move from one layer to another quite easily, they often adhere closely to a specific layer of for foraging, breeding and their other activities. Then the complete procession of primary autotrophic ecological section involves following sequential steps which follows one another. First step in this primary autotrophic ecological section is nudation. What is nudation? Nudation means the process of succession begins with the formation of a bare area or nudation by several reasons such as oceanic eruption, then landslide, flooding, erosion, deposition, fire, disease or other catastrophic agency. New lifeless bare areas are also created by man. For example, walls, stone quarrying, burning, digging, flooding, large land areas, under reservoirs, etc. These also causes the nudation. Second one is the invasion. What is invasion? The invasion is the arrival of the reproductive bodies or propagules of various organisms and the settlement in the new or bare area. Ants are the first invaders, that is the pioneers in any area, because the animals depend on them for their food. So the invasion includes the following three steps. First one is the dispersal or migration. In invasion, the dispersal or migration is the first step. Here, the seeds, spores or other propagules of the species reaches the bare area through the agency of air, water or animals. The process of starting from the time a propagule leaves the parent plant to the time it arrives the bare area is called the migration or dispersal. Then excesses. This is a successful establishment of the migrated plant species to the new area. That is that they arrived the bare area, the seed or spores arrived the bare area. This is known as excesses. It includes germination of seeds or propagals, growth of seedlings, and starting of reproduction by adult plants. Only a few immigrant propagals are capable of doing this under primitive hard conditions, and thus most of them disappear. So, this is the excess stage. Here the spores or seeds germinate in the bare area. Then aggregation, this is the third stage. This final stage of invasion, the successful immigrant individuals of a species increase their number by reproduction and aggregate in a large population in the area, and in consequence individuals of the species come close to each other. And reaction. As the number of individuals of a species increase due to multiplication, all aggregate at the limited place. The competition for space and nutrition is started among them. This is known as interspecific competition. Here, both the competition occurs, that is interspecific and intraspecific competitions. In interspecific competitions, they also compete with individuals of other species that may enter the area. All individuals also interact with the environment. Consequently, due to the increased in the intraspecific competitions and other type of biotic and abiotic interactions. So, the environment is modified and progressively becoming unsuitable for the existing community, which sooner or later is replaced by new invaders or another community. So, here the one community is replaced by another community, that is the known as seral community, due to the competition reaction. The fourth stage is the stabilization or climax. Eventually, a stage is reached when the final terminal community, it becomes more or less stabilized for a longer period of time, and it can maintain itself in the longer period of time, and it can be maintained itself in the equilibrium or steady state with the climate of that area. So, this is the stabilization or climax. Theoretically, at least this last seral stage is mature and self-maintaining, self-reproducing through developmental stages and relatively permanent. The vegetation is tolerant of the environment conditions. It is imposed upon itself. So, this is the stabilization or climax. This is the final stage of the community and ecological succession. This terminal community is characterized by equilibrium between gross primary production and total respiration, between the energy captured from sunlight and energy released by decomposition, between the uptake of nutrients and the return of nutrients by litter fall, that is leaves fall to the earth space. It has a wide diversity of species, well developed spatial structure and complex food chains, and its living biomass is in a steady state. This final stable community of the sere is the climax community, and the vegetation supporting it is the climax vegetation. Here figure shows the primary section versus secondary section. In primary section, it starts from the rocks to the tree seedlings. Then here the secondary section, some weeds and shrubs to the pine and oak trees. This is the primary section versus secondary section. Then how the secondary section emerged from the primary section. Ecological section. If a naturally disaster does occurs, the ecosystem will go back through the stages of succession until it returns to a stable climax community. Ecotones. Here what is ecotone? Ecotone is ecosystems are almost always a patchwork of communities that exists at different sectional stages. Here all the sectional stages occurs in this ecosystem. The sizes, frequencies and intensities of disturbances differ among ecosystem, creating differences in what is called the patch dynamics of communities. Along the edges of each of the patches are areas called ecotones. These junction zones often contain species of each of the overlapping communities, as well as some species that have become adapted specifically for living in these zones. In many cases, the number of species and the population density are greater within the ecotone than in the surrounding communities, a phenomenon known as the edge effect. So, ecotone edge effect is the most important points in the ecosystem. Next one is the ecological niche. What is ecological niche? A ecological niche encompasses the habits of a species. Essentially, it refers to the way of a species relates to or fits it in with its environment. Fit, that is the fit in the environment, that is known as ecological niche. A species adapts to the physical parameters and biota within the community. Natural selection favors the development of a specialized features that allow the species to uniquely exploit the surrounding resources. This is known as ecological niche. Then next one is the conclusion. We come to the conclusion. Ecological section is important for the growth and development of an ecosystem. So there is no ecological section, there is no growth in the ecosystem. So it is important for the growth and development of an ecosystem. It initiates colonization of the new areas and recolonization of the areas that had been destroyed due to certain biotic and climatic factors. Thus, the organisms can adapt to the changes and learn to survive in a changing environment. Finally, significance of ecological section. Ecological section is a very important form of growth and development of an ecosystem as a whole. Some of the points signifying the same are as follows. The sole purpose of ecological section is for ecosystem to reach a state of balance. It is the process by which communities of an ecosystem changes in a defined and directional way over time. Through this process, a relatively unlivable and land is slowly converted into a thriving and vibrant ecosystem. So, the unlivable land is converted into a living zone. This is known as ecological section. It allows new areas to be colonized and damaged ecosystem to be recolonized. So, organisms can adapt to the changes in the environment and continue to survive. Thus, the ecological section is important for the survival of existing species as well as the emergence of new species. Thank you.